February 22nd, 1943, Spatla, Tunisia. A lone M4 Sherman tank sat abandoned in the North African dust, its name still visible on the battered hull. War Daddy II. German engineers from Panzerabteilung 501 approached the vehicle cautiously, their boots crunching on spent shell casings. The tank had been captured intact during the chaotic American retreat just days before. Its crew had fled, leaving behind not just a machine, but a window into American industrial capability that would soon shatter every assumption the German High Command held about their enemy. This tank, serial number WH058941, would soon embark on a 4.5-day journey to Tunis, then across the Mediterranean to Germany itself. What the German engineers would discover during their systematic testing at the Kummersdorf proving grounds near Berlin wasn't just the technical specifications of a single tank. It was the revelation of an industrial avalanche that no amount of German tactical brilliance could possibly stop. But to understand the magnitude of what they were about to learn, we must first go back 8 days, to the moment when German commanders believed they had finally confirmed their long-held assumptions about the American soldier, February 14th, 1943. The Sahara winds howled across the Tunisian mountains as General Lieutenant Heinz Ziegler gave the order to advance. Over 100 tanks and countless half-tracks rumbled through Faid Pass in the pre-dawn darkness, their target the strategic crossroads of Sidi Bou Zid. The Americans had been in North Africa for barely 3 months. Their I-2 Corps, commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, held positions across central Tunisia with the confidence of men who had never truly been tested. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German veterans of the Afrika Korps, hardened by years of desert warfare, moved with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. These men had fought Montgomery's 8th Army across 1,000 miles of sand and rock. They had perfected the art of the armoured ambush, the coordinated use of anti-tank guns and panzers in combined arms warfare. When they looked at the American positions that morning, they saw exactly what they expected to see. Inadequate reconnaissance, poor defensive depth, units positioned where they could be easily isolated and destroyed. The American forces at Sidi Bou Zid had no idea what was coming. 2 infantry battalions occupied prominent hills, Jebel Lesouda and Jebel Ksaira, with limited support and no clear escape route. The German plan was classic Afrika Korps doctrine. The panzers would sweep around both flanks, cutting off the American positions while hidden 88mm anti-tank guns waited in prepared positions to destroy any relief force. It worked with devastating efficiency. When Combat Command C of the 1st Armoured Division rolled forward to relieve the trapped battalions, they drove straight into a perfectly executed ambush. German accounts describe it almost with pity. The American Sherman tanks, arranged in a neat V formation, advanced across open ground with textbook parade ground precision. The hidden anti-tank guns held their fire, allowing the first wave to pass. Then they opened up on the following tanks while German panzers swept in from both sides. The result was slaughter. Of 52 Sherman tanks that began the attack, only 6 returned. 15 officers and 298 men were killed, captured, or missing. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Alger, was captured along with most of his staff. The battlefield was littered with burning American tanks, abandoned equipment, and the shattered confidence of men who had believed their training and their machines would be enough. For the German veterans, it was a familiar scene. They had destroyed French tank formations in 1940 with similar ease. The pattern seemed to repeat itself. Here were the Americans, wealthy and well-equipped, but fundamentally lacking the iron discipline and combat instincts that came from the Prussian military tradition. Their tanks were adequate, perhaps even good by some measures, but they were operated by men who had no idea how to fight a real war. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which followed over the next week, seemed to confirm every prejudice the German military held about their new enemy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, despite being exhausted and technically on medical leave, personally led the offensive. His forces pushed the Americans back more than 50 miles. American troops abandoned positions in panic. Command structures broke down. The greenness of the American forces was on full display. German after-action reports noted the material wealth the Americans possessed. The captured supply dumps were staggering. Food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, all abandoned in quantities that seemed wasteful to German quartermasters who were used to operating on the edge of scarcity. But material wealth without the will to fight was meaningless. The reports concluded what German military doctrine had taught for generations. Logistics and equipment matter, certainly, but in the end, wars are won by superior soldiers, superior training, and superior tactical doctrine. Kasserine Pass ended on February 22nd with a German tactical victory, but a strategic stalemate. The Americans had been bloodied, but British reinforcements and prepared defensive positions eventually halted Rommel's advance. Still, the Germans had captured over 4,000 Allied prisoners and destroyed or captured 183 American tanks, dozens of half-tracks, and over 200 artillery pieces. Among those captured tanks was War Daddy II. The M4 Sherman was an early production model, built in late 1942. It had the distinctive cast hull that gave it rounded contours, different from the welded angular hulls of other Sherman variants. It mounted the standard 75mm M3 gun and was powered by a Continental R9 75 radial aircraft engine. On paper, it was unremarkable. A medium tank, weighing about 33 tons, with a crew of 5, capable of speeds up to 24 miles per hour on roads. But the German engineers who examined it in the field immediately noted several things that were unexpected. The tank's construction quality was extraordinarily high. The castings showed no flaws. The welds on the turret were clean and professional. The internal layout was spacious by European standards, with ample room for the crew to operate. The gun's gyrostabilizer, though the Germans didn't immediately understand its full capabilities, represented technology their own tanks lacked, entirely. More surprising was the tank's operational readiness. Despite being abandoned on the battlefield, it was in excellent mechanical condition. The engine, when they got it running, purred smoothly. The transmission shifted cleanly. The tracks showed minimal wear despite the harsh desert conditions. Everything about the tank spoke of a manufacturing philosophy that prioritized reliability and ease of maintenance over technical sophistication. The decision to ship War Daddy II back to Germany was made quickly. The German Army's weapons office, the Waffenamt, had been tracking American tank development with increasing concern. Intelligence reports from agents in the United States had been sending back numbers about American industrial production that seemed impossible. If these numbers were even partially true, the strategic implications were staggering. The weapons office needed to verify what the Americans were actually capable of producing. The journey from Tunisia to Germany was an ordeal. First, German crews had to drive the captured Sherman across 350 kilometers of North African desert to Tunis. The fact that it made this journey without major mechanical failure was itself notable. German tanks, particularly the complex Tiger and Panther models still in development, were notorious for mechanical breakdowns on long road marches. From Tunis, War Daddy II was loaded aboard a transport ship and sent across the Mediterranean, through waters increasingly dominated by Allied naval and air power. That it arrived at all was fortunate. Many such shipments were lost to submarines or aircraft, but by late March 1943, the Sherman sat in a German proving ground, ready for systematic analysis. Kummersdorf was located about 25 kilometers south of Berlin, in the Brandenburg region. It had served as the German Army's primary weapons testing facility since 1875. The site included extensive firing, ranges, test tracks, and specialized facilities for metallurgical analysis. By 1943, Kummersdorf had become a graveyard of captured Allied equipment. Soviet 34s, British Matildas and Churchills, American M3 Lees, all were analyzed here to understand enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. When War Daddy II arrived, it joined at least one other captured Sherman and several M3 Lee tanks already undergoing evaluation. The testing protocol was thorough and methodical. German engineers photographed the tank extensively from all angles. They measured armor thickness at every point and calculated the effective protection provided by the sloped surfaces. They stenciled these measurements directly on the hull for reference. 51 mm at 56 degrees on the front glacis plate, providing effective protection equivalent to about 90 mm of vertical armor, 38 mm on the side hull, 76 mm on the gun, mantlet. The armor metallurgy was examined. Samples were cut and analyzed in the Kummersdorf laboratories. The steel quality was excellent, showing proper heat treatment and consistent hardness throughout. The armor used rolled homogeneous plate, not the complex face-hardened armor the Germans employed on their newer tanks, but it was well manufactured and would be effective against most weapons in the German inventory at normal combat ranges. The 75 mm gun underwent ballistic testing. German crews fired it repeatedly at various ranges against captured Soviet and German armor samples. The gun proved accurate and reliable. The M61 armor-piercing capped round could penetrate 88 mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 meters at 90 degrees and 73 mm at 1,000 meters. This meant the Sherman could engage and destroy any German Panzer III or early Panzer IV at normal combat ranges. More importantly, the gyro stabilizer allowed the gun to be fired effectively while moving, something German tanks could not do with any accuracy. German doctrine required tanks to stop before firing for best accuracy. The American approach of shooting on the move represented a fundamentally different tactical philosophy. The engine and transmission received extensive testing. German engineers ran the Continental radial engine for hours at various loads and speeds, meticulously documenting fuel consumption, power output, and reliability. What impressed them most was the simplicity of maintenance. The engine could be removed and replaced as a complete unit. Specialized hoists and tools made this a matter of hours rather than days. The entire design philosophy emphasized rapid repair by replacing entire assemblies rather than fixing individual components in the field. The German engineers prepared detailed technical reports. These reports were thorough, professional, and deeply alarming. Not because the Sherman was a technological marvel. It wasn't. The armor was adequate, but not exceptional. The gun was effective against current German tanks, but would struggle against the new Tigers and Panthers entering production. The design incorporated no revolutionary breakthroughs. What was alarming was the manufacturing philosophy the Sherman represented. Everything about War Daddy II spoke of mass production. The cast hull simplified manufacturing compared to welded construction. Standardized components meant parts were interchangeable between vehicles. The spacious interior accommodated a tall crew with room for extensive ammunition storage. Ergonomic considerations that German designers often sacrificed for technical performance were built into the basic design. The tank was designed not for the handful of elite crews who might squeeze maximum performance from a temperamental machine, but for average soldiers who needed something reliable and forgiving. Most troubling of all were the serial numbers. German intelligence had been tracking American tank serial numbers since the first Lend-Lease Shermans had appeared on the Eastern Front in Soviet hands. By analyzing these numbers from captured or destroyed tanks, analysts could estimate American production rates using statistical methods. The serial number on War Daddy II, WH-058941, indicated it was from one of the early production runs, probably late 1942. But the intelligence analysts in Berlin had serial numbers from Shermans captured as recently as January 1943. When they ran their calculations, comparing the gaps between serial numbers with the time intervals, the results were shocking. The Americans appeared to be producing Sherman tanks at a rate of over 2,000 per month. Multiple factories were running parallel production lines, churning out tanks with the same efficiency as automobile assembly plants. The analysts double-checked their mathematics. They assumed there must be errors in their data. Perhaps the serial numbers didn't actually run sequentially. Perhaps there were gaps in the numbering system. But as more intelligence came in, the pattern held. If anything, their initial estimates were conservative. By mid-1943, the statistical evidence was undeniable. The United States was producing medium tanks at a rate that exceeded Germany's total armoured vehicle production by a factor of 5-1. And this was just one type of tank from one nation. Britain was producing their own tanks. The Soviets were churning out 34s by the tens of thousands. Senior German commanders who saw these reports reacted with disbelief. The numbers had to be propaganda. No nation could possibly build tanks at that rate. Tanks were complex machines requiring precision manufacturing, skilled labour, specialised steel, intricate assembly. Germany, with its highly developed industrial base and technical expertise, was struggling to produce 6,000 Panthers over the course of the entire war. The idea that the Americans, who supposedly lacked military tradition and engineering excellence, could be building 8 or 9 times that number of comparable tanks was absurd. But the statistical evidence kept mounting. Captured American supply manifests showed tank unit designations that shouldn't exist if production was modest. Interrogations of American prisoners revealed that back home, multiple factories were running 24-hour production lines. Aerial reconnaissance photographs of American ports showed hundreds of tanks waiting for transport ships. Perhaps most tellingly, the Americans on the battlefield were exhibiting behavioral patterns that only made sense if they had overwhelming material superiority. They would abandon damaged tanks rather than repair them. They would call in massive artillery bombardments to deal with single enemy positions. They operated as if losses were irrelevant, because replacements were unlimited. The reports from Kummersdorf about War Daddy II landed in Berlin in April 1943, just as the strategic picture was becoming clear. In the east, the massive tank battle at Kursk was being planned. In the Mediterranean, Sicily and Italy loomed as the next invasion targets. And in the west, everyone knew the cross-channel invasion of France was coming, though when remained uncertain. German military planning had always been based on qualitative superiority, compensating for quantitative inferiority. German tanks were better. German crews were better trained. German tactical doctrine was more sophisticated. These advantages would allow Germany to defeat larger but more poorly equipped enemies. It was the same calculation that had worked in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. But the Sherman represented something different. It wasn't a superior tank defeated by inferior numbers. It was an adequate tank, produced in numbers so vast that quality became irrelevant. And the truly frightening part was that this wasn't even America's full potential. The intelligence reports arriving at German headquarters painted a picture of an economy that had barely begun to mobilize. American factories that had been producing automobiles 18 months earlier were now producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates that seemed physically impossible. Shipyards were launching cargo vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Aircraft factories were producing heavy bombers in monthly quantities that exceeded Germany's entire annual output. One report, which made its way to Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, estimated that by the end of 1943, the United States would have produced over 16,000 Sherman tanks. Additional models were in development. The M10 tank destroyer, the M26 Pershing heavy tank, countless variants and specialized vehicles, all were flowing from an industrial infrastructure that dwarfed anything Europe could match. Speer, who was orchestrating his own armaments miracle in Germany, understood the implications immediately. He had been touring factories, streamlining production, mobilizing slave labor, doing everything possible to increase German output, and he was succeeding. German tank production in 1943 would reach levels that would have been considered impossible in 1941. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The Americans weren't just building more tanks, they were building entire logistical systems to support those tanks. Spare parts production exceeded German totals. Specialized transport ships were being built specifically to carry tanks across the Atlantic. Training facilities were churning out new crews faster than the Germans could eliminate them in combat. The German officers who examined War Daddy II at Kummersdorf filed their technical reports with professional detachment. But in private conversations, the mood was dark. One engineer was photographed sitting on the Sherman's hull, and his expression says everything. This wasn't the face of triumph. This was the face of a man who had just been shown an equation that didn't balance in his favor. The fundamental problem was becoming clear. Germany could win battles. German tactical excellence, superior crew training, and better individual tank designs meant they could achieve local victories. But they couldn't win the war of production. Every Sherman they destroyed would be replaced within weeks. Every German tank they lost was irreplaceable. The mathematics of attrition were stark and undeniable. What made it worse was that the Americans were learning. The debacle at Kasserine Pass had been a wake-up call. Within days, Eisenhower had relieved General Fredendall of command and replaced him with George S. Patton. Training was intensified. Tactical doctrines were revised based on actual combat experience. The same American system that could produce tanks in overwhelming numbers could also rapidly adapt and improve its methods. By late April 1943, American forces had learned their lessons. At the Battle of El Gueta, just 10 days after Patton took command, American forces fought Rommel's veterans to a standstill. The Second Corps, which had been humiliated at Kasserine, was now demonstrating the tactical competence to match their material superiority. The pattern was becoming clear. The Americans would take their casualties, learn from their mistakes, and come back stronger because their industrial base could absorb the losses. Every battle was training for them. Every engagement made them more proficient, and behind them stood factories that were just beginning to reach their full production capacity. The intelligence analysts doing the calculations in Berlin could see where this was headed. By their estimates, if American tank production continued at current rates, by mid-1944 there would be over 48,000 Shermans completed. In 6 months from when War Daddy II was captured, another 24,000 would roll off the assembly lines. The number was so large it was difficult to conceptualize. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire armoured vehicle production for the entire war would total around 85,000 vehicles of all types, including tanks, assault guns, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery, spread across 6 years. The Americans were producing just medium tanks, just one model, at rates that would match German total armoured vehicle production in a matter of months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. And this wasn't accounting for British production, or Soviet production, which by 1943 was churning out 34s at even higher rates than American Sherman production. The combined Allied tank production was so vast that the German armoured forces, regardless of their tactical skill, were facing mathematical annihilation. The German response to this realization was complex and, in many ways, self-defeating. Rather than accepting that quantity had a quality all its own, German designers doubled down on technical sophistication. The Panther and Tiger tanks entering production in 1943 were marvels of engineering. The Panther in particular was probably the best all-around tank design of the war, combining excellent armour, firepower, and reasonable mobility. But it was also complex, expensive, and time-consuming to manufacture. Where American factories could produce a Sherman in a matter of weeks, Panthers took months. More importantly, the Panther's complexity made it maintenance-intensive and prone to mechanical breakdowns. The same qualities that made it superior on paper made it unreliable in the field. The strategic mistake Germany made was believing they could win through technical excellence alone. Every hour German engineers spent perfecting the design of a new tank was an hour. American engineers spent simplifying manufacturing processes and increasing production rates. Every improvement that made a German tank more capable also made it more complex and harder to build. The Americans were playing a different game entirely. War Daddy II sat at Kummersdorf for months, undergoing repeated testing alongside other captured Allied vehicles. Eventually, the tank may have been deployed with German forces, possibly with Panzer Brigade 150 during Operation Grafe in the Battle of the Bulge. Other captured Shermans certainly were used by German units, often with tragic irony, as reliable vehicles in an army increasingly short of functional tanks. But War Daddy II's real significance wasn't as a captured trophy or even as a source of technical intelligence. It was as a harbinger. Those German engineers examining it in March 1943 were looking at one tank, but they were really looking at the industrial potential of an entire continent that had been awakened to war. The implications reached far beyond tank production. If the Americans could produce tanks at these rates, what about aircraft? What about ships? What about artillery, trucks, radios, and all the countless other items that modern warfare required? The answer, increasingly clear throughout 1943, was that American productive capacity was effectively unlimited for the purposes of this war. Germany had bet its strategy on winning quickly, before the sleeping giant of American industry could fully mobilize. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactical doctrine, it was a strategic necessity. Win fast, before the enemy can bring their full strength to bear. But by 1943, that window had closed. The giant was awake. The factories were running, and the products of American industry were flowing across both oceans in ever-increasing torrents. The test data from War Daddy II showed that the Sherman was a competent tank, but not exceptional. What the test data couldn't show was that competence at scale was far more dangerous than excellence in limited quantities. One Sherman was a target, 1,000 Shermans was a military formation. 10,000 Shermans was an unstoppable tide. The summer of 1943 brought the realities of American production into sharp focus across multiple fronts. In Sicily, American and British forces launched Operation Husky in July, supported by hundreds of Sherman tanks that had crossed the Atlantic in convoys so large they stretched across the horizon. German forces fought brilliantly, as they always did, but they were being ground down by sheer weight of materiel. At Kursk on the Eastern Front, the massive tank battle that German planners had hoped would break Soviet resistance instead became a catastrophic defeat. Among the factors that turned the tide were American-supplied trucks that gave Soviet forces unprecedented mobility and Lend-Lease equipment that freed up Soviet industrial capacity to focus on tank production. The T-34 seconds that shattered German armoured formations at Prokhorovka were supported by an entire logistics network, partly built with American vehicles and equipment. The German officers who had examined War Daddy II were watching their predictions come true in real time. Every intelligence report confirmed the production estimates. Every battlefield engagement showed American forces growing more competent while remaining lavishly equipped. The gap wasn't closing, it was widening. By autumn 1943, the strategic situation had become irreversible. Italy surrendered in September, opening yet another front where German forces would have to fight without adequate resources. In the east, the Soviets had seized the initiative permanently, driving westward with armies that seemed to regenerate no matter how many casualties they took. And in the west, everyone knew the cross-channel invasion was coming in 1944. German tank designers responded to the Sherman threat by designing even more sophisticated vehicles. The King Tiger, with its massive 88mm gun and nearly impenetrable frontal armour, entered development. In technical specifications, it was superior to any Allied tank. In practical terms, it was a strategic dead end. Germany would produce fewer than 500 King Tigers during the entire war. The Americans were producing more Shermans than that every 2 weeks. The fundamental miscalculation ran deep in German military culture. Prussian military tradition had always emphasized the superiority of training, doctrine, and individual excellence. This philosophy had won wars against France, Austria, and Russia in the 19th century. But that was a world where industrial capacity was roughly comparable between great powers. In World War I, the disparities were so vast that traditional military virtues became almost irrelevant. One German panzer commander, reflecting after the war, captured the futility perfectly. We could trade at 5-to-1 ratios and still lose because they had 50 to our 10. This wasn't hyperbole. By late 1944, some German units were facing exactly these kinds of numerical disadvantages. American tank battalions that suffered 60% casualties would be back to full strength within weeks. German units that took similar losses often ceased to exist as effective formations. The story of War Daddy II encapsulates a larger tragedy of German strategic thinking. They captured the tank, studied it meticulously, understood its capabilities and limitations, and completely missed the forest for the trees. They focused on whether it was technically superior to their designs, when the only question that mattered was whether they could produce enough vehicles to match American output. The answer was an unequivocal no. When D-Day came in June 1944, thousands of Shermans rolled ashore in Normandy. German defenders fought with their characteristic skill and determination, but they were drowning in American steel. For every German tank destroyed, 3 more Shermans took its place. The hedgerow battles of Normandy showed American persistence, backed by unlimited material resources, gradually overwhelming German excellence, operating on a shoestring. The final irony came in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, where some captured Shermans may have fought in German colours during Operation Greif. German soldiers manning American tanks found them more reliable than their own vehicles, a fitting epitaph for a war economy that had prioritized sophistication over sustainability. War Daddy II had revealed the future, but the German High Command was institutionally incapable of accepting what it meant. They had captured not just a tank but evidence of their inevitable defeat, wrapped in 33 tons of American steel and pragmatic engineering. The engineers at Kummersdorf had measured every millimeter, tested every system, and documented everything. But no amount of technical analysis could change the fundamental equation. Germany was in a production war it could never win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.